Don't be deceived, my dear brothers. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. My dear brothers, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. For man's anger does not bring out the righteous life that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Do not merely listen to the word, and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word, but does not do what it says, is like a man who looks at his face in a mirror, and after looking at himself, goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But the man who looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom, and continues to do this, not forgetting what he has heard, but doing it, he will be blessed in what he does. If anyone considers himself religious and yet does not keep a tight rein on his tongue, he deceives himself, and his religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world.
This week we'll continue our series through the book of James, continuing where we left off last week. Before that, though, I want to make a couple of announcements. One I forgot to mention at the beginning. Yes, we're having church in the park, but let me maybe say a little bit more about that. You'll need to bring lawn chairs as usual, and you'll need to bring masks for when you're coming and when you're going. When you've been seated, and we're going to be seated sort of socially distanced like we are right now. That's the way you guys usually sit anyway at church in the park, so that won't be a problem. You can take your masks off because we're outdoors. We're going to be congregationally singing for the first time in almost 2 years. It is outdoors, so you'll hardly be able to hear each other. But we will be singing for the first time in a couple of years, so I'm looking forward to that. So keep those two things in mind. And again, if you want to bring a picnic lunch and stay for lunch afterwards, you are welcome to do that. The second thing is a spiritual practice I want to encourage you to participate in that's here on the wall, a congregational timeline. We're taking a few weeks here in August to name some things, some losses that we've experienced as a result of COVID. And so at the top, you've got a timeline where you could peg things that changed or weren't what you had expected or perhaps were less than you had hoped because of COVID. And then underneath, there's room for you to just plant anywhere, just some general things that you grieve, general things that you would name as losses through the pandemic. We've been doing that for a few weeks, and then after church in the park, we're going to turn the corner and start looking at some things that we're looking forward to, or some things that we have learned the value of. A great example of that would be this online live stream. We've always had the ability to do this. We've just never bothered to do it. But I've heard from lots of folks who've shared with me how meaningful this is to have a way to still be able to hear what we do here on a Sunday morning if they can't be here or are unable to be here. It's one of these gifts that's come through the pandemic. And so we're going to name those in the month of September and spend some time during our adult class time talking a little bit about these things and working our way through that spiritual reflection. So, something to look forward to next month. Last week, we began our series through the book of James, and we kind of gave a little bit of an overview. James is a small book in the New Testament that's actually made up of 12 little mini teachings from James, Jesus' brother. And each of those 12 things has a different topic or something different that it talks about through chapters 2 through 5. And chapter 1 is a great, big, rambling, long introduction where James kind of touches on all the topics that he's going to ultimately deal with in these books. And right off the bat in verse 2, James says that we need to see the trials that we experience in life in a whole new light. That the trials are not burdens for us, but instead trials are a means by which we can develop an endurance. We can develop character They're given to us by God for good purpose. Now, the world is not just a closed system of a limited number of resources and a limited number of good things, but instead, rather, we are being asked to see the world as an open place where a generous God gives abundantly to those who ask. Now, likewise, our lives are not just the pursuit of pleasure and happiness, making suffering a moral evil, something to be avoided at all costs, but rather, when trials come, they produce endurance and they draw us closer to a God who abundantly gives. So let's dig into what Catherine has read for us this morning in James chapter 1, starting in verse 16. Now, let me first tell you about my very first life verse. I don't know if you've got a life verse, but a particular verse of the Bible that just kind of rings true. It's your heart's magnetic north. It's just something that has resonated with you. I was baptized when I was 12 years old in the old church building that's just down the road a little bit. And as I started out this journey of faith, I had talked to the minister, Steve, and asked him, okay, what practices, what should I do as I sort of begin the journey here? And Steve said, well, a continuous habit of Bible study is good. And so I thought, well, I know the Gospels and I know Acts, and so I think I'll just start with Romans. So that first week after I was baptized, read through the whole book of Romans and came back the next Sunday, and Steve asked me, okay, so what did you read? And I said, I read the book of Romans. And Steve's like, wow, okay, what'd you think of that? And I said, it was great. Now, to this day, I have no idea what I thought I read in the book of Romans, because as an adult, I can't understand anything out of the book of Romans. Maybe not anything, but it's a very challenging book. And as a 12-year-old, I have no idea how I thought I was tracking with that. But boy, was I in for a treat. As I worked through the New Testament, I eventually got to the book of James. When I read James chapter 1, I felt like somebody was reading my mail or somebody was following me around, because James chapter 1 had me to a T. And in verse 19 and 20, I read something that was the most important thing I'd ever read, the most important advice I'd ever been given. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because the wrath of man does not achieve the righteous life that God desires. It was one of the first verses of Scripture that I memorized. And did I ever need to hear that when I was 12? I thought what I had to say was pretty darn important. And I was a pretty passionate guy, and I would have people telling me all the time, oh, Noel, you're too emotional, you're too emotional. Well, I don't think so. I think, in fact, there were a lot of people in my life back then that weren't emotional enough. We needed a little more passion. Could you give me a bit more? And I couldn't understand when I was a young kid and when I was a teenager why people would have difficulty expressing their opinion on something. I've got lots of opinions. In fact, I'll give you one. You can have it. But I was meeting Jesus for real. And I was beginning to make Jesus the center of my life. And James was now a bug in my ear. And James was saying, talk less. Listen more. And that hit me hard. It was a word that I kept returning to. It's a word that I still have to keep reminding myself. Talk less. Listen more. Eugene Peterson, in his translation of the New Testament, The Message, translates that verse, lead with your ears, follow up with your tongue, and let anger straggle along behind. The conventional wisdom of this verse is also found in other places as well. Some attribute it to Mark Twain, and some people say it was Will Rogers. But I love the words, never miss an opportunity to shut up. Words to live by. Now later in the book of James, he connects the tongue with anger. And there is such a strong connection with the way we speak and the words that we use, and the condition of our heart. Perhaps this is the first time in the book of James that we're going to call out a saying that James has that's got the words of Jesus right underneath. Jesus says in Matthew 12:34, out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. And it's like James is remembering his brother's words. Or the Good News translation, which says, the mouth speaks out of what the heart is full of. Here again, James is delivering another nugget of wisdom to the 12-year-old me. James says, you want to follow Jesus? Do you want to follow him? Well, then watch your mouth. Rein in your tongue, because your mouth reveals what your heart is full of. But the heart can also be transformed by what the mouth chooses to say. James is telling us something really powerful this morning. There is something clarifying about the doing. It resolves what we say into something that's finer. Bitter words and foul speech soil the heart and make bitter words and foul speech more common. But James is saying it also works the other way. It works in reverse. If you claim to be a follower of Jesus, if you claim to have a heart where Jesus sits on the throne as king, use language, written language, text, spoken language. Use language that reflects the internal reality that you claim to have. We ought to be one person, inside and out. One person in what we think and what we say. One person under the rule of Jesus Christ. James knows. He knows that we have a tendency to hear the truth and then treat it like something we're already doing. We all talk a better game than we play. And social media has made this even worse than it perhaps was before. It's taken our natural, irritating tendency and turned it into a nightmare. There is a lot of talk now. There's a lot of talk out there, a lot of knowledge, a lot of information, but less wisdom and precious little good practice. James hits us hard here in chapter 1 with rapid fire punches, a couple ideas here at the end of chapter 1 that should get up in your grill. Don't just listen to the word, do what it says. Mental assent itself, worthless. Later, James is going to skewer us on our practice of professing to believe in God. We'll say more about that. But what James is saying is belief in God is worthless unless it leads to good practice. A famous preacher, Fred Craddock, has said the Bible takes listening very seriously. The Bible terms for listening, the words that appear in Greek in the New Testament and in Hebrew in the Old Testament, are often translated as obey, as if listening seamlessly leads to doing, to obedience. Or maybe it constitutes that first stage of obedience. The Bible doesn't see a difference between listening and obeying. It considers them basically the same thing. And that's James' point in verse 23. Listening leads to doing, or should. Listening leads to doing. A person who listens and then doesn't do is like a person that just glances at a mirror and then walks away and forgets what they look like. In English, we would say, in one ear, out the other. James contrasts this, a brief glance by a forgetful listener, with a gaze in verse 25. A gaze at the true law, the law of truth. One who intently looks. That's in verse 25 where James kind of turns the metaphor a little bit. This mirror becomes the perfect law, the way in which we see our reflection, the way in which we test and we determine where our lives line up and don't line up with the law of Christ, with the goodness that God calls us to. James is a faithful Jew who has come to know God through the law, and as a result has come to know Jesus Christ as the fulfillment of the law. But James knows the law doesn't make one righteous. Hearing the law spoken, it doesn't do any good. It doesn't do any good until it leads to doing. The Apostle Paul says the same thing in Romans, that the hearers of the law are not righteous before God. So try this on for size. George MacDonald wrote, instead of asking yourself whether or not you believe, ask yourself this question. Today, is there one thing that I've done, one thing because Jesus said to do it? Today, is there one thing that I'm doing or that I've done just because Jesus said do it? Or is there one thing that I have abstained from doing this morning or this day just because Jesus said don't do it? It is simply absurd for us to say that we believe in God and then not do anything that he tells you to do. Rather than ask, are you a believer? How about ask this question, are you obedient? Are you a follower of Jesus? Well, do you follow him? Well, no. Well, then you're not a follower of Jesus. Followers of Jesus do that. They follow Jesus. They follow the example of Jesus. They listen to the words of Jesus. They see in Jesus the perfection of God, the love of God, and they aspire to that. They aim at that. What do you do as a mark of obedience to your Lord Jesus? Perhaps it's the practice of holding your tongue and counting to 5 when you might say something you'd regret. Or maybe you have a general practice of just governing yourself and knowing when I'm not too tired to respond appropriately in this situation, I'm going to back off. Or maybe you have a faithful practice of apologizing to your spouse and more importantly to your kids when you lose your temper. Do your kids see you practicing the good way? Do you have any subscriptions that you just cancel because watching that content or reading that content gives you a calloused heart? Do you have a habit of generosity towards the poor? Do you give to agencies who serve the poor? Does being a follower of Jesus make any difference to your life? Does it make any difference in what you say and what you do? So ever since I was a kid, I've been slowly learning to say a little bit less. I've been learning to govern what I say with a desire to turn over the bitterness that I found in my heart, that found it so easy to find space to grow in my heart. And I continue to learn this practice, and I continue to have moments of trial. And so it was kind of ironic this week on Friday when I went to the MTO office. And I stood in line for 3 hours. I stood reading a commentary on the book of James, where it talked about taking joy in trials, and where it reminded me that the wrath of man does not produce the righteous life that God desires. It was a surreal moment. I was being tested, and I was being asked to find joy in it. I was being trained and to learn to deal with my rage. And I was taking it to Jesus. For 3 hours, we were just taking it to Jesus and just, Jesus, here it is, man. This is my heart. This is what I want. I had plans of how to throw a brick through the window of that building on Bunting Avenue. Now, there's a camera on the one side, but there is not a camera on the Walmart side that I spent 45 minutes looking at. You could probably hit it from there. Now, I'm not suggesting that you hit the MTO office on Bunting Avenue, 240 Bunting Avenue, next to the mall there on Welland. I'm not saying you should do it. I'm just saying if you did it, I would understand. Now, seriously, I do have a theory about that office and why you should never go to that office, but this is being broadcast live, and so to avoid libel and slander, I've learned we're just going to do that in person. So if you want to hear more about that office, you come talk to me. We can talk. I could probably save you some grief. But anyway, I learned these things, and I practiced these things, and had to re-practice them. And in fact, I found this is the way I am. It wasn't until Saturday that I could properly reflect on this and recognize what's going on, that my sovereign claim on the world was being threatened by this office, and that I was being asked to wait for what would seem to be an inappropriate length of time. My pride was being questioned, and I was finding that just unbearable. In prayer, Jesus reminded me that waiting in government offices is not the height of suffering, and that there are places in the world where far, far worse things are happening, and that Jesus himself suffered far greater. I was reminded in my heart of the silliness of my objections. And I had to confess that. But what escaped my notice in this life verse of mine is the text that's surrounding it. As James wanders through the topics that he's going to come back to starting in chapter 2, he drops a few hints in verse 20 of where this is headed and what God is up to while I was learning to close my mouth and not speak. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word that is planted in you, which can save you. Now, first of all, moral filth. Now, hang on, James. I'm just thinking about throwing a brick through the window of the MTO. I'm not even really thinking about it. I'm just imagining it. But James is talking about something different. Receiving the word planted in you. Now, that's new. What's that all about? In a few weeks, we're going to talk about the connection that James draws in his book between the words that we use in our hearts in chapter 2. But here in brief, James looks ahead. A foul mouth frustrates the finer word that's been planted in your heart. Perhaps it was planted there while I wasn't looking, or maybe it was planted there a long time ago. God has planted a seed, his word, in your heart. God prepares you for greater desires than you would have otherwise. God prepares us for nobler pursuits through our discipleship, through our following Jesus. It's what God has always done. God's always been doing this. Back in verse 16 at the beginning of what Catherine read for us this morning, James warns us, don't be deceived. This is not something you're going to hear from the world. Don't be deceived. Don't listen to what you're being told. The truth is, every good and perfect gift comes from God. James says it comes from God, the Father of lights. It's a really cool phrase that only appears here in Scripture. It uses intricate wording that draws from the world of astronomy, among other places. In fact, translating this part of James is quite difficult because the grammar is a little funky, and the words that appear here at the end of chapter 1, they appear here in James, nowhere else in the New Testament. So when you come to them, I don't know what that is, got to look it up. Yep. It's because it only appears here. It'll never appear again. Last week we talked about a distracted nature that we tend to have. We're distracted and deceitful, but God gives us a nature that's consistent, that's unified, an identity that yields a new way to see the world, not a double-minded soul that responds this way or that way, depending on the day, depending on the temperature and the humidity and how long you've been waiting. A heart with integrity, a heart with unity. God plants this word in our hearts, his word, Jesus, the word of truth. God gives us birth through this word of truth. Again, the words of Jesus pop up here. Jesus said the same thing to Nicodemus in chapter 3 when he talks about being born from above, being born again. Jesus gives birth to new life in you. Our faith produces a new life in us. By God's grace, through the power of God's Spirit, Jesus doesn't make bad people good. Jesus makes dead people live. That's what Jesus is up to. God is constantly like this. God's like the sunrise, the astronomical lights, the moon, the stars, day in, day out. They do what they do. The sun rises, the sun sets. Sun rises, sun sets. The moon moves through its phases. The stars turn in their courses. And God is constant. God is constant as he plants this new seed of life in us. And the question is, are you living it? There is another dimension to this new life God is constantly giving. God is the source of new life, and you are called to be a conduit of this new life, not a dead end. You're being called to be a conduit of the love of God, not its end point. James says you're deceived if you fail to govern your mouth, but you're also deceived if the love of God finds a place in your heart and then just stays there and doesn't move. God is a constant giver. God gives you the capacity to give too. We are blessed in order to be a blessing. We're not the end point of God's love, but we're a conduit. We're the place that stops on its way. Now, there is a way to miss the point of verse 27. In fact, there's a way to miss the point of the whole book of James. If you fail to appreciate that God gives every good gift including the capacity to give. The looking after widows and orphans that happens here in verse 27 through God's agency isn't coming from our agency. In other words, we don't look after widows and orphans. God does through us. Do you see the distinction? God's grace is extended through you and through me. That widows and orphans are cared for by God through us. We are the conduit through that. We are changed through that. We are changed because of that. We joyfully participate in what God is doing. God doesn't give you a calling, though, without giving you the capacity to answer the call. How cruel would that be? If God calls you to do this and then doesn't give you any of the tools you're going to need to accomplish it. God gives. And God invites us to share what's been given. God's love is a gift, and it's a gift that's meant to be practiced. Now, you may have seen this week in the e-bulletin an invitation to participate in the Community Care Food Drive. It's on Saturday, September the 18th, and they're looking for volunteers to help collect tons and tons of donations. It's the big food drive for the year for community care. They collect food from the entire town of Lincoln, and they sort it at the community center on Central Ave, and they're looking for volunteers. Truth is already organizing something for the people in Truth, the teen group. But I'm wondering if you'd like to participate in that as well. They're looking for people to sort food. They're looking for people to drive around and collect food. And you can sign up using the link in the e-bulletin. Now, there is perhaps only one thing better than volunteering for something like that, is having your kids or having your grandkids watch you do it. Bringing your kid along to help. Bringing your kids along so they can see you serve in the name of Jesus. You can tell your kids about Jesus, but there's nothing like them watching you act like him. It has power. The good news in the text this morning is the constancy of God. God's justice and his character are true. That God is a giver. God gives always. And God gives us every good thing. And we receive God's goodness. And we are given the means to share that good gift. You've now heard God's good word. So now let's do it.